There are all sorts of ways to classify logical fallacies. For example, we can talk about fallacies of relevancy, or fallacies of presumption, or fallacies of ambiguity. We can also talk about fallacies of grammatical analogy, or fallacies of weak induction. There are also other ways we can talk about fallacies and classify them. For example, we can talk about fallacies of language. We can talk about fallacies of oversimplification, or fallacies of argumentation. Moreover, we can talk about procedural fallacies, or even metaphysical fallacies. I'm the Amateur Logician from amateurlogician.com, and one of my goals is to become more logical. Because, hey, we're thrown in a world with a lot of illogical thinking, and that's precisely why it's important to learn logic. Now, we're going to go through this classification scheme. Now, we're going to go through some of these fallacies, not all of them, just to get a general sense of ways we can classify fallacies. In any case, different textbooks have slightly different ways to classify logical fallacies or to group them. Philosophers and logicians have differences in their classifications, emphases, and sometimes even in their definitions. Also, fallacies can technically overlap with each other. Now, there is certainly no exhaustive list of fallacies. The number of fallacies human beings, especially politicians and those who promote politicians, engage in is nearly endless. Now, presently, we're not going to go through each and every one of these fallacies to define them. Instead, we're going to consider rough ways to classify general types of fallacies, and we'll talk about some specific fallacies as we go along. Now, in this, I'm using 3 references. We're going to be using A Concise Introduction to Logic by Patrick Hurley. Second, The Art of Reasoning by David Kelley and Debby Hutchins. And third, the outstanding textbook Socratic Logic by Peter Kreeft. We're going to start with Patrick Hurley's classification scheme. So if we're thinking about fallacies of relevancy, we should first think about good argumentation. Now, good argumentation is to the point. It consists in providing evidence that's relevant for a specific conclusion. In contrast, fallacious argumentation diverts attention away from the issue at hand. It brings up irrelevant issues, irrelevant arguments. Consider, for example, the ignorato elenchi fallacy. It's the missing the point fallacy. Somebody gives an argument that's supposed to bring us to conclusion X, but the arguer actually argues for another conclusion Y. While Y might be related to X, it is not identical to X. Hence, we have the ignorato elenchi fallacy. Likewise, things like the argumentum ad populum or the argumentum ad hominem are relevancy fallacies. They bring up irrelevant issues. Patrick Hurley's textbook talks about fallacies of presumption. Again, let's think about good argumentation. Good argumentation contains evidence. Evidence comes from premises that are relevant to the conclusion and, at the same time, independent of the conclusion in such a way that none of those premises presuppose the conclusion from the very outset. In contrast, presumption fallacies contain premises that already presume what they are meant to prove. Such arguments don't actually prove their conclusions. Consider, for example, the petitio principii fallacy. It's the begging the question fallacy. When someone engages in the petitio principii fallacy, they assume as true what they are to prove. If I argue God exists because he exists, or if I argue God doesn't exist because he doesn't exist, those beg the question. Those assume what they are trying to prove. The premise and the conclusion are identical. The premise is he exists. Conclusion, God exists. They're identical. It begs the question. Or we have the conclusion, God doesn't exist. Premise, he doesn't exist. The conclusion and premise are identical. Now, to beg the question doesn't mean to raise the question. So if I find an elephant in my backyard, that raises the question, how the heck did it get there? It doesn't beg the question, since to beg the question is to engage in a fallacious argument. So let's not use beg the question in a false sense. And there are other presumption fallacies like the false economy or suppressed evidence. We also have fallacies of ambiguity. I'm sorry that the screen did that. But we have fallacies of ambiguity. Notice the importance of language here. In order to think logically, we need to think logically about terms. If we are equivocating on a term, we're not reasoning in a sound way. Equivocation is using a term in more than one way. Consider the example from the logician William Jevons. All metals are elements. Brass is a metal, therefore brass is an element. It may not be obvious that the term metal is being used in two different senses. It's first being used in the way a chemist defines metal, then is defined in a loose sense found in the arts. Brass is not a metal in the first sense, as it is an alloy of copper and zinc and thus not an element. So we have the fallacy of equivocation. We have an ambiguity there. Now, amphibology concerns how the structure of a sentence can be interpreted in more than one way, and we can also engage in fallacies that are similar to equivocation. Then Patrick Hurley talks about fallacies of grammatical analogy. So we have composition and division. Here are fallacies that confuse collective and divisive predication, which, by the way, we also covered in another video when thinking about using words logically. For example, the fallacy of composition engages in fallacious part-to-whole reasoning. We can often view it as a case of equivocation since the collective term is being confused with a divisive term. Finally, there are fallacies of weak induction. To be sure, Patrick Hurley has an overly broad definition of induction. Pretty much anything that's non-deductive will be viewed as inductive. But be that as it may, there's all sorts of fallacies that go with this. This includes false cause fallacies. For example, we have the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy. It's the after this, therefore because of it fallacy. P comes before Q, so P must be the cause. Yet logically concluding that P is the cause of Q requires more than just finding out that P comes before Q. Other inductive fallacies include the argumentum ad vericuitum. It's a fallacious use of untrustworthy authority. So that is Patrick Hurley's way to divide up the fallacies. Now let's consider David Kelley and Debby Hutchins in their great book, The Art of Reasoning. So here we'll be briefer. They talk about the fallacies of relevancy as one type of classification, and that includes, for example, the fallacy of subjectivism. My feeling, for example, that such and such is true is most of the time entirely irrelevant to if, in fact, it is true. In general, fallacies of relevancy introduce premises that are not relevant to or for the conclusion in question. We have fallacies of an inductive nature, which again is very similar to Hurley's textbook. We have fallacies of presumption, which includes begging the question or the petitio principii fallacy. And finally, there are fallacies of division. This is when an argument goes off track from the wanted conclusion. In this sense, though, we might wonder if it's really a good category to separate from fallacy of relevance. But now let's look at my favorite traditional logic book, that is Socratic Logic by Peter Kreeft. He has the fallacies of language. And it's a good category, I think. Kreeft not only covers things like equivocation and amphibology, but he includes things like slogans and hyperbola. Think about it. How many times do people confuse slogans with arguments? Yet a slogan is not an argument, period, end of story. And of course, we have fallacies of diversion. Diversion moves us off course. It takes us off track. Consider things like the ad hominem or ad populum, the ad baculum, and so on and so forth. Another good way to categorize fallacies is by oversimplification. Consider the black and white fallacy. Oftentimes there's more than two options. There are shades of gray. Or consider quoting out of context. That would be another case of oversimplification. There are also fallacies of argumentation, as Peter Kreeft calls them. Here, Kreeft highlights fallacies that are, so to speak, in the form of an argument. For example, an argument that begs the question, petitio principii, or an argument that proves something different, namely the ignorato elenchi. We also have fallacies of induction. Think about the hasty generalization. We have a small sample and then hastily conclude that the population at large must have the same attribute. But also consider the argument from silence. From someone not saying something about X, it doesn't mean he believes in X or doesn't believe in X. We can't make a conclusion from that silence alone. Kreeft also talks about procedural fallacies. He calls these logical protocols. For instance, refuting an argument by refuting its conclusion, or assuming that refuting an argument disproves its conclusion. and in fact does no such thing, technically speaking, or think about just ignoring an argument, or substituting explanation for proof, or shifting the burden of proof, or winning the argument but losing the arguer, or vice versa. Finally, there are metaphysical fallacies, which is a pretty cool category to think about. But these metaphysical fallacies show up a lot, especially, for example, reductionism. Reductionism is taken for granted in a lot of arguments, but it shouldn't be. It's a metaphysical view that's arguably simplistic. Or consider, for example, the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. That's a very interesting fallacy. And arguably, in fact, Plato himself engages in that fallacy, because he thinks that abstract objects exist in some third realm. It's misplaced concreteness. Does triangularity as such exist, for example? I would say no. An Aristotelian would say no. Triangularity only exists, so to speak, as it is in the form of any individual triangle. It doesn't exist in some third realm. So arguably, Plato, we might say, engages in the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. We also have things such as confusing quantity with quality, or the fallacy of accident, or confusing the natural with the common, or confusing the logical, psychological, and physical because. So this is what you get with Socratic Logic by Peter Kreeft. This is just a rough outline. At the end of the day, it's more important to recognize a fallacy when a fallacy has been engaged in, rather than just label it as a fallacy with a certain title. So this is just an introduction, an overview of the fallacies, and we'll consider this more in depth in the future. I'm the Amateur Logician. Until next time, be well. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you soon.